is a pleasure to be here in South Australia again. How many of you were here the last time? I've recognized quite a few friendly faces. Not that the rest of your faces aren't friendly, but looking forward to meeting some more, making some more friends. So the session we're going to cover this afternoon is an overview session, an overview of this series, I, Child. I think you may remember the last time I was here, I was talking about doing this series, actually, and it is now complete. This is 3 hours of information on how electronics are programming our children's brains. I won't make you sit here for 3 hours, though, so if you want more information, you'll have to check out this DVD series, but we will cover an overview of it today and just look at a perspective on all 3 sessions. A recent study found that children spend more time with electronic media than they do in any other activity aside from sleep. More time than any other activity aside from sleep. And now, children might be spending more time than any activity aside from sleep, but young people are actually spending more time in electronic media than any other activity, including sleep. With the current average at 8 to 12 hours per day, with heavy users as many as 18 hours per day. Can you imagine? That's a lot of time in media. 75% of children, it's a bit higher here in Australia, closer to 80% of children aged 0 to 8 have access to a smartphone. Nearly 40% of children are using tablets. We could go on down the list illustrating that media has taken this current generation by storm. We see statistics like never before. But maybe you're saying to yourself, well, hang on, I mean, those stats really don't apply to my family. I'm keeping my children away from it. We don't use that much media. Well, you probably would agree, though, that children are using more media now than they did 30 years ago, right? Whether you're using 8 to 12 hours a day or 1 hour a day, we're still using more media than we used to. Children are growing up with more media than they used to. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how is it affecting their brains? I'm a researcher in brain development. It's of much interest to me that media is definitely affecting them because we know that the environment of a child impacts the way the brain develops. And so we change the environment to a more media-based environment, it's going to affect the way the child's brain develops. We don't have to spend time on shocking statistics to know that something has changed in the environment and children are going to be affected by it. And I do want to clarify, a lot of material, a lot of DVDs have been produced that are talking about the content of media, bad content in media. I think as Christians, though, it's sort of assumed that we don't want to put our children in front of bad content media. Am I correct? Yeah, I mean, obviously, by beholding, we become changed. Why would we want to put them in front of poor content? And so the question we're going to ask in this session is not about content. It's about the media environment in general. So educational media, interactive media, supposedly good types of media, how is that affecting them? You know, I find it interesting that never before in history have we been so connected, and yet our social lives are shallower than ever. Or what about the irony that never before have we had so much to grab our attention while attention deficit disorders are on the rise? Where's the disconnect here? Kids have access now to more information than ever in history right at their fingertips, the tap of a button. And yet test scores and school performance are on the decline. What gives? Where's the disconnect? Eagerly we snap up the next and the greatest gadgets. We consider them a help and an advancement in our lives. We pass them on to our children and consider them the greatest advancement in babysitting technology of the millennium. We blindly assume that these tech companies producing these gadgets must have assessed their effects, or have they? Is it that simple? Is there a cost? Are there reasons for concern? Are there side effects? What really are the effects of these fancy toys? Perhaps we should take a step back and consider whether or not it is affecting them. Again, obviously it's affecting them. How is it affecting them, though? The reality is we have been grossly uninformed, as I titled this session. Rarely, if ever, are the effects actually considered by the market. In fact, the research on electronics is usually overlooked, especially by those selling them and advocating them. And it's true that electronics and technology are beneficial. I'm using a PowerPoint and a computer. We have a screen here. I own a smartphone. These are tools that we can use in our lives. But I believe it's time we stopped the free-for-all and took an informed approach, and especially made a differentiation between the age at which we are using electronics. What may be okay for adults and the adult brain is not necessarily okay for children and the child's brain. And when we consider the effects, we'll definitely be dialing back, if not nearly eliminating electronics use for our children. I'd like to look at it from a perspective of sort of scales here. We have benefits of technology. We have damages involved with technology. Will the benefits outweigh the damages, or will the damages outweigh the benefits? How does it look? Let's just take a balanced perspective. What are some of the benefits? Well, we have educational value for literacy and numeracy. We have social benefits. There's hand-eye coordination benefits cited for many types of gaming. It can help creativity and can teach good values to children. All of these are often cited as benefits of technology and media. Now, I would like to ask the question, are there better ways that we could obtain these? Have children been able to obtain literacy and numeracy, social benefits, hand-eye coordination, creativity, and good values before the advent of media? Yeah, they were. How did they do it before media? Well, there were other methods. So media isn't the only way we can obtain these things. And so, yes, there are benefits. I'm not going to spend so much time on this, though. I want to look at some of the ways that it is damaging the brain. And so let's just look at a few points with regards to us being uninformed. The first one we have is tech addictions. Media has an addicting power that is unimaginably strong. Meet William. William is 4 years old, and according to a recent article, one morning at 4 a.m., William, at 4 years old, marched into his dad's room, woke his dad up, and said, "Hey, Daddy, I need the iPad." Need the iPad. Well, Dad marched William back to bed and told him that what he really needed was to go back to sleep. But when Dad woke up at 7 a.m., he found his iPad, which had been in his room, gone. And he found William in the living room playing a game on the iPad, the battery level indicating he'd been playing for 2 hours. And this wasn't the first time William had been exhibiting such symptoms. Later that day, as they considered William's actions, they realized that William had become an iPad addict. Now you're thinking, iPad addict? I've heard of tobacco addicts, alcohol addicts, but iPads? It's true. We have a new category in the Diagnostics Manual for Addictions of tech addictions. Addictions that are just as strong as any drug or alcohol addictions, and actually stronger in many cases. An article came out a few years ago titled, "Toddlers are becoming so addicted to iPads they require therapy." Children as young as 4 are becoming so addicted to smartphones and iPads they require psychological treatment. This particular article was mentioning a 4-year-old girl from the UK who had to be medically treated for an addiction to the iPad. Dr. Richard Graham began the UK's first technology addiction program about 3 years ago, and he says that these are not isolated cases, that of William and in this little girl. He said there are many more young addicts of this age. He says that young technology addicts experience the same withdrawal symptoms as alcoholics or heroin addicts when the devices were taken away. And so to get their kids unaddicted, parents are sending their children to Dr. Graham's clinic and spending nearly $20,000 for a 28-day digital detox. But maybe you're saying, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. One other quote I want to share here. This comes from Dr. Nicholas Kadaris, one of the premier elite addiction specialists in the United States. He says, "I've worked with hundreds of heroin addicts and crystal meth addicts, and what I can say is that it's easier to treat a heroin addict than a true screen addict." That is frightening, quite frightening. So maybe you're saying, though, hang on, my child is really not that addicted. I hope not. But perhaps we should consider what constitutes an addiction. What does it really mean to be addicted to something? And as I studied this out myself, I said, whoa, I need to be careful about my own device usage. This can apply to adults just as much as children. Symptoms of tech addiction, you can Google it. It's quite easy to find. This comes from an article in Live Science. Symptoms, withdrawal. Just like drug or alcohol addictions have physical withdrawal symptoms. Same story with tech addictions. In 2011, the researchers asked 1,000 college students around the world to go without their devices for 24 hours. I'm amazed they found 1,000 students willing to do that. At the end of just 24 hours, though, many reported symptoms such as anxiety and actual depression as a result of pulling them away from their smartphone. So if your child is irritable, anxious, sad, depressed, temper tantrums, whatever it may be, after you're pulling the technology away from them, good indication there they may be developing an addiction. Tolerance. Just like a drug addict needs stronger and stronger hits to get what they need, to fulfill their needs for the drug, same story we find. A child that used to do it for 5 minutes now needs 20 minutes, and then they need an hour, and the usage just builds. A loss of interest in other activities. A child who once loved to play outside and now all they want to do is sit there on the iPad, another indication they may be pushing towards an addiction. A lack of control. Now, 4-year-olds are not exactly known for their self-control abilities, but if we notice that the child is just completely unable to control their device usage, that is another indicator of a possible addiction. Deception. If they're hiding their usage and trying to minimize it, another indicator. A means of escaping reality. This is one I've seen very often in my research. A child confronts a difficult situation, and their natural response is to go toward technology or a device of some sort. And lastly, losing opportunities just because they want to spend more time on their device. Again, I think these symptoms of tech addiction may be more common than we'd like to admit, are they not? I certainly considered my own device use as I considered what constitutes an addiction. And okay, whether or not we are all out addicted, I think this raises some important questions. If technology is so powerfully addicting, we need to be very careful about giving it to a child that doesn't have that frontal lobe very well developed yet. There's a reason they don't let children access drugs and alcohol. I'm not advocating it for later in adulthood, of course, but the reason they don't allow it for young children, and they do for adults, is they expect that the frontal lobe of the adult can control their usage, which obviously it doesn't sometimes and develops into serious addictions. But again, they're making a differentiation between what age we're allowing an addicting substance. And so, I realize we probably can't totally eliminate it from our children's lives, but we need to be very careful because they don't have those frontal lobe developments yet that will enable them to control their usage. Our second point here, perhaps you're wondering, what are the current recommendations for media usage for children? If it is so powerfully addicting, what are the researchers really recommending? Well, that's a little bit difficult to answer because it depends on who you ask. Back in the TV days, it was recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics, no screen time for children under the age of 2. More recently, Dr. Constitutes of the Seattle Children's Hospital has done extensive research and officially recommends limiting screen time prior to age 3. But Dr. Constitutes is not the only voice. Many other researchers are urging keeping kids screen-free into later ages. Typically 7 or 8 is an average age often given. Dr. Chris Rowan, though, a pediatric occupational therapist, recently published an article titled 10 Reasons Why Handheld Devices Should Be Banned for Children Under the Age of 12. She's actually advocating it being illegal to give a child a device under the age of 12. Now, this article obviously generated an enormous amount of controversy. Some people said, well, this lady just went way too far. But when you look at the research she's citing, she's quite sound. I'm just going to briefly run through some of the reasons she gave. One of those is rapid brain growth. What she means by that is in the first 3 years of a child's life, we know that their brain has an explosion of development. And we also know that the areas of the brain that are responsible for spirituality, for cause-to-effect reasoning, emotion, relationship skills, behavior management, language, memory, moral understanding, conscious development, and character development. Pretty important list here, right? Do you want children to be deficient in any of these things? Definitely not. Why do we have this list? All of these areas lays the foundation in the first 7 years of life. And so what do? Instead of letting them lay the foundation in good ways, we babysit them with the iPad and hope that the iPad is somehow going to build these areas. which it definitely is not going to do as well. Another reason that Dr. Chris Rowan cited was delayed development. We know that movement is very essential, and we also know that lower levels of moderate to physical activity, higher levels of sedentary time, particularly their combination, were related to poorer reading skills in boys. And again, I'm just citing one study there. We know that physical activity is very important for children. The more time we're giving them in sedentary time, the more damages it is going to be, and we can potentially see delayed development. Obesity was another one she mentioned. They did a meta-analysis of 173 studies, looked at the results from all of them, and found that 86% of the studies found a statistically significant relationship between increased media exposure and an increase in childhood obesity. Sleep deprivation, another reason that she named. This almost goes without saying with the inordinate amount of hours that they're spending in the media use. But we needn't do any math ourselves. A study out of Boston College found, now get these numbers, approximately 75% of children are sleep deprived. Also, about 75% of children are allowed televisions in their bedrooms. Do you think there's a connection between those two numbers? I would have to imagine so. Dr. Rowan also mentioned mental illness. I don't have time to get into all the aspects of that, but we are seeing connection between mental illness, developmental disorders, and media use. Aggression, attention deficit disorders, which I'll touch on in just a moment. Addictions, we've already seen, and radiation emission. We know that the World Health Organization has classified cell phones as a carcinogen due to radiation emission, and we know that young brains are even more susceptible to it than adults. So what are the current recommendations? Well, it really depends on who you ask. But if you're asking some of the top researchers out there that are citing some very viable research, it's looking like it's going to be closer to 12 years of age to start allowing technology. So how's our scale looking here? Getting some rather heavy damages, are we not? Not so heavy on the benefits side right now. But let's continue. Health risks. They did, again, the same meta-analysis I mentioned with the obesity study. They looked at 173 studies over a period of 30 years. This is a massive research project. And they wanted to see if there was any connection between media use and poor health. Absolutely there was. Again, I don't have time to get into all of the research. It's all on the DVD series. But to put it in summary, their findings, they found connections to childhood obesity, tobacco use, drug use, alcohol use, lower academic achievement, earlier sexual behavior, attention deficit disorders, and hyperactivity, all connected to media use. Point number 4, eye damage. This is a really significant one we're going to spend a few more minutes on. A recent study found 65% of Americans reporting symptoms of what's called digital eye strain, a new symptom they're having to come out with. And they're actually reporting 75% of the younger generation is experiencing digital eye strain. It's bad for adults, but it's even worse for children. We've also found that the rate of nearsightedness in the U.S. has increased 66% since the 1970s. What else has increased since the 1970s? Media use? Definitely. Television first, and on through there. We also know that children who spend less time outside were at greater risk of developing myopia. These two factors, the screen time is typically up close, as well as the time indoors, are both associated with the development of myopia or nearsightedness. Again, I don't have time to explain all of the research behind that, but there's very strong connections there, and that is why we're seeing the explosion in nearsightedness. But there's even more to it than that, and that is something known as blue light. It's titled blue light. It's a high-energy light. It's not necessarily blue in color. But light exists on a spectrum of colors, as we know. We have red over here all the way up to blue. This is the visible light. But there is more light than what we can just see. And so if we take this blue spectrum and we go just past the blue, we get into ultraviolet light. And that is a very high-energy light that we see the effects of every time we get a sunburn. I got myself one of those just a few days ago. And that is high-energy light radiation on the skin creating a sunburn. So the eye has natural filters right about at the edge of the visible spectrum. When we go outside, those natural filters in the eye are kicking in, and so that our eyes don't get damaged by the radiation outside. You realize people have lived for thousands of years without sunglasses. Sunglasses are not absolutely essential to our eyes. Sure, they can be good, but our eyes have built-in filters. They say about 99% of ultraviolet light is filtered by our eyes. The problem we run into is when we get just below the threshold of visible light, of non-visible light, just below ultraviolet light, and into this blue area, and that is called high energy light. It is visible now, and so our natural filters in our eye are not filtering it out, and it's going straight in the eye because it's visible light. Our screens are chock full of what is known as blue light, high energy light, as we see classically here in our eye-child image. But again, even if it's not necessarily blue in color, it is the nature of the the light emitted from our screens. Scientific American, the light from our devices is what is called short wavelength enriched, meaning it has a higher concentration of blue light than natural light. That is the nature of screens. It's how they're made. Combine the light emitted from the screen and put the screen up close, and you've got a deadly combination for our eyes, especially children's eyes. We know that the blue light from the devices penetrates all the way to the retina because it's bypassing the natural filters of the eye. It penetrates all the way to the retina, which is the inner lining at the back of the eye. Laboratory studies have shown that too much exposure to blue light can damage the light-sensitive cells in the retina. This causes changes that resemble those of macular degeneration, which can lead to permanent vision loss. And it is more significant for the developing eye up till about age 10, but it definitely does affect adults also. And I probably don't have to explain that this is certainly not going to help anything. This is only going to make the problem worse. Now, let me clarify here. Not all what is called blue light is bad. Sunlight has a lot of this type of light in it as a natural part of the sunlight. And we know that this type of light helps with alertness, mood, cognition, memory, and most importantly, it's very important for maintaining the body's circadian rhythm. And here we see yet another problem, though, of the light emitted by the screens. It's influencing the circadian rhythms, which is very important for sleep. So what happens when we sit there in the evening and chill on our phones? Very impactful to our sleep habits. Blue light affects the levels of the sleep-inducing hormone melatonin more than any other wavelength. Healthy sleep patterns and deep sleep in particular are dependent on normalized circadian cycles and adequate melatonin secretion, which is suppressed by both screens and man-made EMFs. Deep sleep is essential for critical thinking, focus, memory, and mood. And again, I would just encourage eliminating it for children. There's no need to be messing with their eyes and their sleep cycles. I realize, though, that it does affect adults also. And some of us work jobs where we have to be involved with technology. I do. I spend way more time than I wish on my laptop, writing presentations, doing emails, such and such. So how can we help avoid the problems we find there? Well, one of the things to do is get a blue light filter. They make apps for your phone or programs. Some computers even have it built in. Turn that on as you're nearing evening if you have to be on your device. But if you possibly can, arrange your schedule so that you're spending more time on your computer in the morning. It's not going to help with how it affects your eyes, but it's at least going to help with how it affects your circadian rhythm. Point number 5, interactive media. It is often said, I hear it a lot from parents as I talk about media, they say, yeah, we already got rid of the TV. We don't have that in our house. And I say, great, but there's more than just TV. And it's often assumed that interactive media is somehow better because their children are connecting with it. Well, unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. A recent article was published by Dr. Victoria Dunkley titled, "Interactive Screen Time is Worse Than TV." Now, that caught my attention because the interactive screen time is supposedly really good for kids, the educational media and such. So I said, wow, what is the reasoning she's given here? Well, Dr. Victoria Dunkley is a pediatric psychiatrist, and she spent many, many years doing extensive research and treating children. She says, way back in the day when all we had was television to deal with, she said, my standard approach when I had a child come in that was having psychological or psychiatric issues of some kind, she said, I would just dismiss the television. I'd tell them, take the television away for a few weeks. She said, more often than not, that completely fixed the problem. I did not have to do any further treatment. She said, but now we're starting to get all these other devices coming in, the iPad and the smartphone and the computer and everything else. And she said, so now I'm realizing I have to take those things away also. But what's interesting is she's done some comparison studies now that we have all these different types of media. And so she started taking away the television and leaving the interactive media, and she found that her treatment program would not work. She said, but I could take away the interactive media, the stuff that's supposedly good, and leave the television, and the treatment program would work. She says, even if a small amount of interactive screen time remained outside of school, the intervention didn't work. She's done clinical observations on hundreds of patients, the typical overstimulated, impulsive, hyper-aroused kid on screens. I'm sure we've seen some of those. The dramatic changes in mood, focus, and compassion capacity while off of them, even if TV was allowed, and the setbacks that occurred when the handheld devices returned. Very interesting research. She also found that just 30 minutes of either computer use or gaming caused disturbed sleep and daytime fatigue compared to 2 hours or more of TV required for similar effects. You actually had to sit there at the television for 2 hours to get the same bad effects that you would acquire from just 30 minutes of computer use or gaming. Computer use and gaming, and smartphones, I would add, is like television on steroids. It's intensified. She explains, the very interactiveness, the part we think is good and beneficial, is overly stimulating to the nervous system, especially a developing one, via sensory and circadian reactions and psychological and physiological hyperarousal. Once the arousal stress cycle becomes chronic, it will eventually cause damage to the nervous system. And now notice what she says. Mere moderation of screen time is often not sufficient to interrupt this vicious self-perpetuating cycle. I hear it from parents often. They're like, yeah, I'm going to cut back a little bit. She says it doesn't work to cut back a little bit. Mere moderation isn't going to do it. You're going to have to completely remove it for at least a period of time. And again, Dr. Richard Graham has a 28-day program, so at least that long to break the cycle. Much more we could go into on interactive media, but I'm going to skip ahead here to point number 6, and that is some of Dr. Jane Healy's research. She's one of the premier educational psychologists of the past couple of decades in the United States, and she's done extensive research on media, and she has a list here, and again, I don't have time to get into all of the points that she has and the reasons behind them, but I'll just run through some of the reasons she names and how electronics are impacting children. She says it overstimulates children and creates a passive withdrawal. It's causing an overstimulated effect in the brain where it's bombarding them with too much information. She says it causes attention and listening problems. I'll get to ADHD in a moment. It emphasizes skills which do not transfer well to reading or listening and requires less mental effort than reading. So if we're trying to encourage children to have good reading skills and we condition them to an environment that takes less mental effort than reading, then pretty soon they're not going to enjoy reading. It shortens the time children are willing to spend on intellectual problems they are set to solve. We're actually decreasing problem-solving time. It artificially manipulates the brain into paying attention. It's forcing them to pay attention. How? By violating its natural defenses with frequent visual and auditory changes. It induces neural passivity. Do we want neural passivity? Neural referring to the brain cells, passivity referring to not doing anything. Neural passivity, inducing the brain to actually shut off, and they actually find that when they do brain scans. When they're involved with certain types of media, the frontal lobe begins to shut down. It reduces the brain's ability to remain actively focused on a task. And she also, her last point is that television in particular, and many other forms of media, have a hypnotic, and she says possibly, this book was written a few years ago, we now know it positively is, neurologically addictive effect on the brain by changing the frequency of its electrical impulses in ways that block active mental processing. Now, I'm going to just insert a note here because I hear a lot from parents. They're like, well, hang on, you just took away my best babysitter. She said, nothing holds my child's attention like giving them my iPad or my smartphone. I see it all the time as I travel in airports. You have a child who's fussier about something, they give them the device and shuts them off. Why? The key right here, hypnotic. It is designed to hold your child's attention. It should not be a surprise to you that it's the best thing you can find to hold their attention. It's made that way. It's designed, it's engineered by the software engineers and designers to hold your child's attention. The question should not be whether it holds their attention, but whether it's good for them to be holding their attention. So, how are we looking on our scale right now? Pretty heavy on the damages, are we not? That was a brief overview of uninformed. I believe we have been very uninformed by those promoting the media and selling it about what it's actually doing to us. But there's another question we need to ask ourselves. What about educational media? And that's the second disc in the series iChild, Uneducated. How is educational media benefiting or not benefiting our children? Is it affecting them? Well, for sure, children can learn some things from educational media. But we should, again, ask the question, are there side effects? And we should also look at the question of long-term effects. Is it benefiting them on the long term? For starters, let's consider a certain school district that has implemented technology. This is Kyrene School District in Arizona in the U.S. Since 2005, they have spent nearly $33 million on educational technology, with an additional $43 million slated for further investment in educational media. So if anywhere should be seeing some gains from educational media, it ought to be Kyrene School District, should it not? They've spent more money than just about anyone else out there. So how's it going? Well, since 2005, the very year in which they started instituting educational media, scores in reading and math have stagnated in Kyrene, even as statewide scores have risen. Well, it's not helping them very much. David K. Schauer is the district superintendent, and he was asked, well, how's it going? Are you seeing any results from spending all this money on educational media? His response, my gut is telling me we've had growth, but we have to have some measure that is valid, and we don't have that. I'm afraid that's a poor reason to spend $33 million. Now, to be sure, test scores can go up and down for many reasons, but really to many researchers across not just the U.S., in many other countries, schools are spending billions of dollars on technology and failing to see proof that it's actually helping. They did a study in the U.S., a $10 million study, no doubt out of taxpayers' money, of 15 educational software products. It is the most extensive federal study yet to follow methods that the U.S. Department of Education considers scientifically rigorous. Major study. This should pretty well define for us whether it was beneficial to spend all this money on educational media and technology. And again, the money is being spent all over the U.S. It's not just the Kyrene School District. That was just one example. So what did this study found? I quote, no difference in academic achievement between students who used the technology in their classrooms and youngsters who used other methods. No different. $10 million spent on a study, and they found no benefits. Another study in 2009, a review by the Education Department of research on online courses, which more than 1 million K-12 students are taking, found that policymakers lack scientific evidence of their effectiveness. Much educational software is not an improvement over textbooks. They went and contacted Tom Vander Ark. Tom Vander Ark used to work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he is now an investor in educational technology. Now, if you're investing in something, and somebody asks you about it, are you going to be like, nah, it's not very good? No, you're going to say, you're going to talk it up as best you can, right? You're going to try to sell them on this thing, because the more you sell of what you're investing in, the more money you make. He was asked, he's investing a lot of money in educational media and technology. How's it going? What do you think about it? He says, quote, the data is pretty weak. It's very difficult when we're pressed to come up with convincing data. The person investing in it. Now, it's interesting that there is actually a school system that has adopted a no media policy. Waldorf schools, they have some things that maybe aren't the best, but some things that are actually very, very positive. And they believe in children playing, doing artistic work, singing songs, playing games, stories, outdoor time, practical tasks, cooking, cleaning, gardening. Sounds like your average home, maybe. In fact, they actually say that the classroom is intended to resemble a home, with tools and toys, usually sourced from simple, natural materials that lend themselves to imaginative play. But, while that's a radical education program, Their most important change that they've made, or thing that they do, is that they have a no media use policy until 8th grade. Their children are just not involved with it. So how's it going for them? Very well, actually. They produce some of the best students in the world, most of them going on to prestigious universities. Yes. Do you have one here? A Waldorf school. Oh, wow, that's great. You know what's even more interesting about these schools, though, is that there are an unusually high number of these schools in and around the Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley, where all these big tech companies are, where all these CEOs have to have a school to send their children. Where are they sending them? More often than not, to a Waldorf school, a tech-free school. In fact, the chief technology officer of eBay sends his children to a 9-classroom school here, the Waldorf School of the Peninsula. So do employees of Silicon Valley giants like Google, Apple, Yahoo, and Hewlett-Packard. Alan Eagle, who's a computer scientist and works in executive communications at Google, says, "I fundamentally reject the notion that you need technology aids in grammar school. The idea that an app or an iPad can better teach my kids to do arithmetic, that's ridiculous." Chris Anderson, CEO of 3D Robotics, says, "My kids accuse me and my wife of being fascists and overly concerned about tech. And they say that none of their friends have the same rules. Well, that's because we've seen the dangers of technology firsthand. I've seen it in myself, and I don't want to see that happen to my kids." These guys design it. They know what's happening, and they say, we don't want our children involved with it, despite the fact that they promote it as educational. Steve Jobs, the one who invented the iPad, which has revolutionized education. So many schools are implementing it, and it's supposedly so helpful. He was asked, "What do your kids think about the new iPad? How are they liking it? It's so educational. It's so good for them, right?" Quote, "They haven't used it. We limit how much technology our kids use at home." Steve Jobs himself. Alan Eagle, the one I quoted a moment ago, who's a computer scientist and works at Google, he says, "My daughter doesn't even know how to use Google." And so the interviewer asked him, but how are they ever going to learn? I mean, we live in a technology-saturated world. How are your kids going to learn how to use technology later on? He said, "No problem." Quote, "It's super easy. It's like learning to use toothpaste. At Google and all these places, we make technology as brain-dead easy to use as possible. There's no reason why kids can't figure it out when they get older." The people designing it say it's brain-dead easy. I'm not sure I want to be too involved with something that's brain-dead. A Waldorf school student himself is quoted as saying, "Being able to think creatively and imagination are much more important than just being able to know how to Google something." Good point the kids got. So when it comes to the benefits of education technology, we're not really seeing some significant gains, and we're actually seeing that the ones who are producing it are keeping their children away from it. But what about some more impacts on how media is impacting children's ability to learn? Well, let's first focus on attention deficits. I mentioned earlier that we'd spend some time on this. Let's do that. It is interesting that ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, has risen drastically in recent years, and so has media use. They've gone right with each other, actually. In about the past 6 years, ADHD has risen 15%, while media use has risen about 20%. They're really going up pretty close together. Why am I mentioning this in terms of educational media? Well, you kind of have to be able to pay attention to do well at school, right? So, what is attention? I looked it up in the dictionary. It is defined as a concentration of the mind on a single object or thought. That's an excellent definition. Question, though, is most educational media typically a single object or thought, or many objects or thoughts? Yeah, if you look at the way most educational media is structured, it's bombarding kids. It's designed to hold their attention, and the way it does that is just fast-forwarding them through stuff. It's not the concentration of mind on a single object or thought, and that's precisely the problem and the connection to ADHD and ADD. It is designed to hold attention. And so as we condition them to something that is holding their attention for them, they don't learn how to hold the attention for themselves. A child's ability to stay focused on a screen, though not anywhere else, is actually characteristic of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. which is really interesting because in the educational communities, many times what is prescribed for a child that has an attention disorder is to give them a more media and technology-based learning environment. And what this research is beginning to indicate is that that is actually making the problem worse. It's not helping anything. How so? Well, let's back up to what Dr. Jane Healy said. We read this earlier, that much early development, sorry, we didn't read this earlier. This is a new quotation here. Much early development of physical and mental skills and their foundations in the brain comes from experimenting and solving problems with what kind of materials? Real-world materials. The iPad is not quite so real-world. The long-term outcomes of, notice what she says, forcing children's attention unnaturally may have even more serious implications than we have realized. Notice, forcing their attention. In other words, they are not the ones having to hold their attention. Something else is doing it for them. And in fact, most children's programs are planned with an eye on capitalizing on those involuntary responses. They can't help it. It's involuntary. It's designed to just capture the mind and hypnotize them and pull them into it. And so here's what happens, to put it in a very simple nutshell. As children are conditioned to having something else hold their attention, they lose the power to hold the attention for themselves. Does that make sense? Is that clear? You see, real life does not grab you like media does. Is reading and study and playing with books and Legos and gardening and playing outside and doing chores, are they quite as engaging as media or gaming? Not quite. They're actually comparatively boring, and that's the problem. With media, be that TV, smartphone, iPad, whatever, it's designed to hold a child's attention for them. They don't have to work to focus on something. And so we begin to see the attention deficits arise, and pretty soon, school, books, and study are no longer interesting. In the last 50 years, we've created, this is Dr. Dimitri Christakis, one of the premier researchers on media's effects on children from the Seattle Children's Hospital. In the last 50 years, we have created platforms in which we present things in surreal time. It's not real life, in other words. When you condition the mind to become accustomed to high levels of input, there's a chance that reality can just become boring. And so, essentially, when it comes to using electronics as a means to engage or reward, it works until it doesn't. Soon enough, dysregulation rears its ugly head, and more stimulation is required for focus, identical to mechanisms in drug addiction. When children, and notice this is the most important part here, when children report non-screen activities as boring, have you heard that before? When they do that, this should be a red flag to parents and educators. The child has become accustomed to an unnatural level of stimulation. That's Dr. Victoria Dunkley. And it's Dr. Jennings Bryant, who has served on the Research and Planning Committee for some of the top educational programs, media educational programs around the world. He says, we work so hard to grab the child's attention. That's their goal. They want to hold the child's attention. We work so hard on it that sometimes I'm afraid we forgot the learning. We may have created a child who was so reinforced to go after the excitement and the rewards that the learning was almost secondary. That's an excellent point he makes. I think back to when I was a child, my grandma was a teacher, and so it was all about, educating me. And so she had this new educational media program on her Mac, which was, I think, one of the first computers ever invented, and maybe not quite, but very old computer. And I really honestly don't remember anything about this computer game she was having me play, except the game I get to play if I got enough right answers. Something to do with a mouse getting cheese and avoiding a trap. I don't remember exactly. The subject, though, I honestly don't remember. I even asked her about it, and she's like, yeah, I don't remember either, but I remember the game. That's what he's saying here. We work so hard to grab their attention. I was perfectly attentive to this game, and I got a lot of right answers, so I must have been learning, right? I can't remember anything about it, except the game I was playing. We have created a child who was so reinforced to go after the excitement that the learning was almost secondary. Very good point he makes. More studies on attention deficit disorder. We could spend a lot of time on this. A meta-analysis found 69% reported statistically significant relationship between increased media exposure and ADHD and other attention problems. The Journal of Pediatric Psychiatry found association between television viewing and ADHD. The American Academy of Pediatrics, associated with attention deficit problems in childhood. Dr. Dimitri Kostakis, Seattle Children's Hospital. Kids under the age of 5 who watch 2 hours of TV a day were 20% more likely than kids who watch no TV to have attention problems in school age. And again, interactive media is like TV on steroids. It's going to make the problem only worse. Another study found 1.6 to 2 times more likely to have attention problems as they were spending more than 2 hours a day in front of a screen. Another study, combining the research from 50 studies, found a significant correlation between media use and ADHD. Victoria Dunkley again. Because electronics are stimulating, video games and other interactive screen media are being marketed as learning tools. But studies show these interactive screen media types have an adverse effect on attention and impulsivity over time, especially in children who already have attention problems. To put it very simply, Herman Maurer, we are heading toward a global attention deficit syndrome, if we're not already there. Okay, moving quickly here. Our second point, something known as digital dementia. This is fascinating. Digital dementia. They have actually found that they first noticed this in South Korea, a country that uses way more technology than most of the rest of the world, and they found that about 15% of the young population exhibiting brain symptoms and actual physiological brain changes exactly the same as late-onset dementia that you would see in elderly people. Exactly the same. A deterioration in cognitive abilities that is more commonly seen in people who have suffered a head injury or psychiatric illness. A UCLA study, so it's not just in South Korea, this was in the US, found that about 14%, same percentage incidentally, that South Korea had 15%, US 14%, of young people aged between 18 and 39 complained of memory problems. What's happening is that individuals who rely heavily on technology may suffer a deterioration in cerebral performance, such as short-term memory dysfunction. How and why? Well, again, I'm not going to take all the time to explain it, but it's pretty basically like this. Many children don't memorize anything because they can Google it. Same for all of us, right? Why remember something if you just look it up on your smartphone? And we're actually deteriorating our memory abilities. But there's more to it than that, and that is our third point, brain imbalance and right hemisphere damage. A doctor, again from South Korea, Seoul, Korea, found that overuse of smartphones and game devices hampers the balanced development of the brain. Now this we know beyond the shadow of a doubt. This is shown in research all over the world. But what this doctor has found that is unique is he says that heavy users are likely to develop the left side of their brains, leaving the right side untapped or underdeveloped. Now, this is still a bit controversial. Dr. Jane Healy is suggesting that it may actually be damaging the left hemisphere. Other researchers are saying it's damaging to the frontal lobe. I think it's probably just damaging to our whole brain, actually. But what's particularly interesting about this, if we look at what happens when the right side of a person's brain is somehow damaged or underdeveloped. What happens? Right hemisphere damage is typically associated with difficulty with attention. Do we see difficulties with attention commonly now? Yep. Perception, learning, memory, organization, insight, and orientation. We have seen a decline in most of these areas. Pretty good connection to what he's saying, that we may be actually seeing a deterioration in the right hemisphere. We also see poor social communication. Do we see poor social communication now? You can't even talk to anyone now. They're on their phone. Difficulty with recognition and expression of emotion. That's a major problem we're having in childhood and youth. Difficulty reasoning and problem solving. Another problem we're seeing. So while there may be controversy over, what part of the brain it's actually damaging the most, I think we can pretty conclusively say that, yeah, there are some effects to the right hemisphere and some possible damages. But what's even more significant is that the right hemisphere is very associated with spirituality. Very connected to spiritual strength and understanding, as is the frontal lobe. Do you think the devil maybe knows what he's doing here? Working to damage an area of the brain associated with spiritual strength and understanding? I would have to think so. But it's not just the right hemisphere. Remember I mentioned the frontal lobe earlier. we find damages there too. The anterior cingulate cortex, a key area located within the frontal lobe that is associated with impulse control, decision-making, emotion, controlling emotional responses, attention, motivation, notice this one, error detection. Do Christians need a healthy dose of that? And the center of the free will. What happens if we have a damaged anterior cingulate cortex? We see OCD, PTSD, depression, addictions, poor emotional regulation, poor motivation, neuroticism, sensation-seeking, and impulsivity. Have we seen a rise in all these things in society in general? We certainly have. So why am I bringing up the anterior cingulate cortex? Very simple. Something known as media multitasking. Anyone ever done media multitasking? I think most of us probably have. The most basic definition of that is simply using more than one form of media at a time. Maybe you're watching a video and texting at the same time. But there's another form of that, and that is what we often find in internet research, where you look up something and, oh, that's an interesting link, and you look at it for 5 seconds, and you go back, and you're like, oh, this is a more interesting one. Oh, yeah, copy-paste that one, and, okay, go back. Different search term, and am I right? This is how we're often looking at things online. And so what they find is that is actually another form of media multitasking. They say if you're not focusing on something for longer than about 10 or 15 minutes, you're engaged in an activity that may possibly damage the anterior cingulate cortex. A study found higher media multitasking activity is associated with smaller gray matter density in the anterior cingulate cortex. And just to explain, smaller gray matter is not really a positive thing when you're talking about a brain area. The study revealed a significant relationship between media multitasking and brain structure variations. Individuals who reported higher amounts of media multitasking had smaller gray matter density in the ACC, anterior cingulate cortex. Our main finding indicated that heavier media multitaskers had smaller ACC volumes. The ACC serves as a crucial nexus of information processing pathways in the brain. And down to the white part of the quote there, the ACC is generally thought to be involved in error or conflict detection. A critical area of our frontal lobes being damaged actually shrunk with media multitasking, and they've also now found connections with internet addiction, which is defined as just spending too much time on the internet. Again, damaging to the ACC. Pretty significant damages, eh? Definitely something to be concerned about in the educational community as we pile on more educational media for our children. These are not things we want to be happening to our children, or for us as adults, for that matter. Definitely something to be careful of. So in the last few minutes, though, I'd like to touch on just a couple of quick points from the last session in the iChild series known as Unreality. This has been a concern of mine as a researcher that we are now replacing what used to be reality with the screen. Children's lives are vastly different from what they used to be. Things have changed in the environment of kids today, what they expect, the activities they do, what they consider normal, and the concept that the changed environment is changing our kids. A study found children learn to tie shoelaces later than ever before. Can you remember learning to tie shoelaces? I do. Children learn to tie shoelaces later than ever before. Today's children now learn to operate complex technology long before they know how to tie shoelaces. We are damaging a child's sense of reality. Children develop their sense of what is real and what isn't, what psychologists call reality testing, between the ages of 3 and 10. If they are exposed to reality-blurring imagery, and that is just essentially saying exposed to anything that is not real life, it's blurring their concept of reality. It compromises their ability to discern reality. Kids' brains develop during key developmental windows when they engage their active imagination in such things as creative play. Kids who are just passively stimulated by the glowing screen don't have to do the neural heavy lifting to create those images. The images are provided for them, thus stunting their own creative abilities. Essentially, it's pre-baked creativity. They're not having to imagine things for themselves. Somebody's dishing it out for them. They don't have to come up with it in their own, and we're stunting their creative abilities. We find, I mentioned earlier, it is overstimulating, it's attention-grabbing and addicting. Both of those things are not the real world. It is also not real-world communication. A recent study in Canada found that parents spend an average of 3.5 minutes per week participating in meaningful conversation with their children. 3.5 minutes a week. That is really, really sad. And of course, it doesn't need explaining that an electronic machine of whatever description does not engage in two-way conversation, which children need to become confident communicators. I could also, there's some research I share in one of my other series on that Dr. Jane Healy explains how children need to talk as well as to hear. And the problem is we put them in the classroom where they are talked to all the time. They come home where they're interacting with the media, and neither of those environments are giving them interactive communication. It is not real-world interaction. So what's the solution? Let's consider how kids' lives used to be. They used to play outside. They got plenty of physical exercise. They helped out with the daily work inside and out. They learned by exploration. They experienced real-life consequences. They learned with pencil, paper, textbooks, and a human teacher. Am I correct? Yes. Yeah, this is how it used to be. This was standard-issue childhood. Has it changed, though? Yes, it's been pushed aside, and now, instead of playing outside, they play on their smartphone. Instead of the physical exercise, they're sedentary. They're indoors with TV viewing. Instead of helping with the daily work inside and out, their work is replaced by screen-based entertainment. Instead of learning by exploration, they're getting spoon-fed, pre-baked creativity. Instead of real-life consequences, you just pressed reset, right? It used to be if you broke something, you had to fix it or clean it up. If you dropped something on your toe, it hurt. And now you just, oops, reset. No real consequences. They learned with pencil, paper, textbooks, and a human teacher, and we've already seen very clearly how the e-books, the interactive whiteboards, and educational games are not benefiting children in the long term, according to some of the best studies that have been done. And yet, the research shows that children who play outside, the things they used to do, they're more fit and healthy, they have stronger immune systems, more active imaginations, more creative, reduced stress, less aggressive and violent behavior. They have increased attention spans. And what do we see about the attention spans in media? Decreasing them. They have better cognitive functioning, while the fresh air generates a stronger immune system, has fewer allergies, lower incidence of asthma, improves oxygen flow to the brain. It contains phytoncides, which are very critical chemicals that we find from the trees and the plants outside that benefit the development of the brain. Sunshine provides vitamin D, improves eye health, may reduce the risk of diabetes and heart disease, raises serotonin levels, and positively affects sleep by adjusting circadian rhythm and melatonin levels. What did we see about the screens and the blue light earlier? Negatively affecting sleep and melatonin levels. So I'm just quickly running through this list just to illustrate that God's methods and the natural environment that He designed for children are far more beneficial according to the modern scientific research. What type of mud do you want your children in? What type of gardening do you want them in? We know that useful work is beneficial. If your child can use a smartphone, he can easily operate any of the above. Correct? But now it's considered child abuse to make your child do the laundry. It's not. This is how it used to be. This was normal life. So, and again, let me just mention, it's not just the children. Keep in mind your own media use and the time it is separating you from your children. To put it in a nutshell, we have seen scientific evidence that media is highly addicting, has many health risks, has eye damage, remember the retina and the myopia damage, negative effects from blue light. Interactive media is more damaging than TV we saw. Educational media is not helping on the long term. It's causing attention deficit disorders, digital dementia, brain imbalance and right hemisphere damage, anterior cingulate cortex damage, overstimulating. It's not real-world communication, and it is not real-world interaction. On our scale of things, how's it looking? Pretty heavy on the benefits, right? The damages. Not many on the benefit side of things. It was Dr. Raymond Moore, one of the premier researchers of the last century on education. He wrote, "Quietness, calmness, and freedom from what kind of excitement? Artificial excitement. Build strength in the immature child. but he was really just reflecting what had already been written in the book Child Guidance. The more quiet and simple the life of the child, the more free from artificial excitement, and the more in harmony with nature, the more favorable it is to physical and mental vigor and spiritual strength. Did the Lord know what he was talking about? Why did we have to wait to see the modern research to say, oh yeah, I guess God knew what he was talking about? Let's not do that. You know, the Lord has given us much more counsel than just this as it regards to media or various aspects of childhood. Let's take what he says on faith, shall we? And just know that he has a plan. He knows what's best for children, and believe that he knows what is best. I think this whole technology discussion should really just be injected with some common sense. I realize that many of you are wondering, but there's benefits of technology. How do we balance all this out? Again, there's a difference in age. We saw the research showing up till about age 12, it's very harmful. Children don't really need it at a young age. We use it as a part of our lives. It's often a necessary evil, if you will. It is how we live our lives. And so that's okay. It is a tool we can use carefully. But when it comes to children, I think if we look at the real effects on them, we'll be dialing back, if not nearly eliminating it, for our children under the age of 12. And maybe some of the research appears inconclusive at times. As I've compared the research, though, over many years, never have we seen research come out that says, oh yeah, we were wrong about the bad effects of media, and we found that it's like super, super good. It never goes that way. It's always the good stuff promoted by the technology companies, and eventually the research catches up, because the research is always behind the technology. The research catches up and says, oh yeah, that wasn't very good. Well, then it's a little late, right? Because we've already instituted it. So let's just apply the preventative approach and be very careful and common sense about our children's media use. Thank you very much for your time. Again, if you'd like more information, you can pick up the iChild series. For those watching online, you can go to thinkinggeneration.org and purchase the iChild series and many other series. Thank you again. Got an announcement.